Hello, my dear friends. Tonight, we begin a slow and careful journey into everyday life during the medieval period, focusing on something deeply personal yet often misunderstood: hygiene. This is not a story of filth alone, nor a tale shaped by exaggeration. Instead, it is a quiet historical exploration of how people in medieval Europe understood cleanliness, the body, health, and daily care, using the knowledge and resources available to them at the time. The medieval world stretched roughly from the fall of the Roman Empire to the early modern age, and during these centuries, ideas about hygiene changed gradually rather than suddenly. People did care about cleanliness, but their understanding of what caused illness was very different from ours today. Without germ theory, hygiene was shaped by tradition, religion, environment, and habit rather than science. Cleanliness was often linked to balance, comfort, and moral order rather than invisible microbes. Water played a central role in medieval hygiene, but it was not used in the same way we expect today. Many medieval towns were built near rivers, wells, or streams, and water was collected daily for cooking, washing, and cleaning. Bathing did occur, though not always frequently and often depended on season, class, and location. Cold water was common, especially among the poor, and bathing in winter was sometimes avoided due to fear of illness caused by cold and dampness. Soap existed in the medieval world, though it was not widespread or standardized. Early soaps were made from animal fat and plant ash, producing a rough but usable substance. These soaps were more commonly used for washing clothes than bodies. For personal washing, people often relied on water alone, sometimes combined with herbs or scented oils. Clean linen clothing was considered a major part of personal hygiene. Changing garments was believed to cleanse the body indirectly, as dirt and sweat were thought to be drawn away by fabric. Religious belief strongly influenced hygiene practices. Cleanliness was associated with spiritual purity, and many religious communities maintained strict routines of washing hands, faces, and feet. Monasteries often had structured washing schedules, and some even maintained bathhouses. However, excessive bathing was sometimes discouraged, as it was believed to weaken the body or encourage vanity. Balance was key. Cleanliness was valued, but excess was suspicious. Public bathhouses continued to exist in many medieval towns, especially during the earlier centuries. These bathhouses were social spaces as much as hygienic ones. People bathed together, talked, and relaxed. Over time, however, concerns about morality and disease reduced their popularity, especially after outbreaks of plague. This shift contributed to later misconceptions that medieval people never bathed at all, which is not supported by historical evidence. Dental hygiene was limited but not absent. People cleaned their teeth using cloth, small sticks, or herbs. Some medieval texts mention powders made from crushed shells or plants. Toothache was common, and treatment options were limited, but awareness of oral care did exist. Bad breath and visible decay were recognized problems even if solutions were basic. Hair and grooming were also part of medieval hygiene. Hair was washed occasionally with water and herbal mixtures. Lice were a common issue, especially in crowded environments, and combing was an important practice. Archaeological finds include fine-toothed combs designed specifically to remove lice, suggesting regular attention to this problem. From a historical perspective, medieval hygiene was shaped by practicality rather than neglect. People worked physically, lived close to animals, and lacked modern infrastructure, yet they developed routines that made sense within their world. Cleanliness was not ignored, it was simply understood differently. As this first part comes to rest, imagine a quiet medieval morning. Water is drawn from a well. Hands are washed before work. Clean linen is put on. The body is cared for in small, familiar ways. This is where our journey begins. To understand medieval hygiene properly, historians focus first on the daily lives of ordinary people, because the majority of the medieval population lived outside castles and monasteries. Peasants, villagers, and town workers followed routines shaped by labor, seasons, and available resources. Hygiene for them was not a separate activity, but something woven quietly into everyday life. Most medieval people began their day early, often at sunrise. Before work, washing the hands and face was common. Water was drawn from wells, rivers, or communal pumps and stored in simple containers. This water was cold, and washing was brief, but intentional. Medieval texts and household records suggest that starting the day with clean hands and face was associated with readiness, order, and respectability. Dirt on the face was noticed and often corrected, especially in towns. Full-body bathing was less frequent, but it did happen. For peasants and laborers, bathing often occurred seasonally rather than daily. Summer offered warmth and easier access to rivers and streams, making bathing more practical. In winter, bathing was reduced because cold water was believed to weaken the body and invite illness. This belief was rooted in medieval medical theory, which emphasized balance and protection from cold and dampness rather than cleanliness for its own sake. Clothing played a major role in hygiene. Clean linen garments were considered essential for bodily cleanliness. Linen was worn next to the skin and absorbed sweat and dirt. People who could afford it changed their linen regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes more often. Washing clothes was labor-intensive, involving boiling, beating, and rinsing in rivers. Because of this effort, clean clothing became a visible sign of hygiene and social respectability. Medieval people also paid attention to grooming. Hair was combed daily, not only for appearance but to remove dirt and parasites. Fine-toothed combs found in archaeological sites show careful design specifically for lice removal. This suggests that lice were common, but also that people actively tried to manage them. Grooming was practical, repetitive, and familiar. Hands received particular attention because of food preparation and work. Medieval households washed hands before meals and after labor. Communal eating practices reinforced this habit. In many homes, a basin and pitcher were placed near the eating area so that hands could be washed before sitting down. This practice appears repeatedly in household manuals and religious texts, indicating its importance. Smell mattered in medieval society. Bad odors were associated with illness, decay, and moral disorder. While medieval people did not understand bacteria, they believed foul smells could cause sickness. As a result, bodies were wiped, clothes aired, and homes ventilated when possible. Herbs were sometimes carried or placed in living spaces to improve scent and comfort. Living conditions influenced hygiene heavily. People lived close to animals, fields, and open fires. Dirt was unavoidable. However, this did not mean indifference. Medieval hygiene focused on managing dirt rather than eliminating it completely. Clean hands, fresh linen, groomed hair, and controlled smells formed the core of everyday cleanliness. From a historical perspective, these routines show intention rather than neglect. Medieval hygiene was shaped by effort, environment, and belief. It was quieter and slower than modern hygiene, but it was present, consistent, and meaningful within its context. As this part settles into calm continuation, imagine a village at dawn. Water is fetched. Faces are washed. Linen is shaken out in the morning air. Life begins clean enough for the day ahead. Bathing in medieval times is often misunderstood, largely because later centuries created the image that medieval people avoided water altogether. Historical evidence tells a more balanced story. Bathing did exist, but it followed cultural beliefs, seasonal rhythms, and medical theories very different from those of the modern world. Medieval people did not reject bathing. They approached it cautiously and purposefully. In the early medieval period, especially between the 9th and 12th centuries, public bathhouses were common in many European towns. These bathhouses were often inherited from Roman traditions or inspired by them. Town records, travel accounts, and legal documents confirm their presence in England, France, Germany, and other regions. Bathhouses were places where people washed, relaxed, and socialized. Men and women sometimes bathed separately, though mixed bathing also occurred in certain areas and periods. Bathing was often a communal activity rather than a private one. Large wooden tubs were filled with heated water, and people entered in turns. Soap was rarely used for the body, but water alone was considered sufficient to remove surface dirt. Herbs such as rosemary, lavender, or sage were sometimes added to the water for scent and comfort. These herbs were not believed to kill disease, but to strengthen the body and improve balance. Medical beliefs shaped attitudes toward bathing. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of humors, which taught that the body needed to remain in balance. Warm baths were believed to open the pores of the skin. While this was sometimes seen as beneficial, it also raised concern. Open pores were thought to allow harmful air or illness to enter the body. Because of this belief, frequent bathing was sometimes discouraged, especially during times of plague or seasonal sickness. Seasonal bathing patterns were common. People bathed more often in summer when warmth made water less dangerous and rivers were accessible. In winter, bathing was reduced, particularly among the poor. Cold water was believed to shock the body and weaken resistance to illness. Instead of full baths, people focused on washing exposed parts of the body, such as hands, face, and feet. Private bathing also existed among wealthier households. Noble homes sometimes included private bathtubs, and servants prepared warm water when required. Bathing could be associated with comfort, healing, or special occasions rather than daily routine. Some medieval medical texts even recommended baths for certain conditions, such as fatigue or joint pain, showing that bathing was not universally feared. Over time, especially after repeated outbreaks of plague in the 14th century, attitudes toward public bathhouses changed. Because bathhouses were social spaces, they became associated with immorality and disease. Many were closed or repurposed. This decline contributed to later assumptions that medieval people avoided bathing entirely. In reality, practices shifted rather than disappeared. From a historical perspective, bathing in medieval times was about moderation. Too little washing was uncomfortable and undesirable. Too much bathing was believed to weaken the body. Cleanliness existed within this balance, shaped by belief, environment, and experience. As this part continues quietly, imagine a medieval town bathhouse on a summer evening. Steam rises from wooden tubs. Voices are low. Water soothes tired bodies. Bathing is not a luxury nor a habit of excess, but a careful act within a world seeking balance. When examining hygiene in medieval times, one of the most important and often misunderstood areas is how people managed human waste. Toilets, waste disposal, and sanitation were practical necessities, and medieval societies developed systems that, while simple by modern standards, reflected clear awareness of cleanliness and order. In rural areas, waste disposal was straightforward. Villagers typically used outdoor pits, fields, or designated areas away from living spaces. Human waste was sometimes reused as fertilizer, particularly in agricultural communities. This practice was not viewed as unclean in itself, but as part of the natural cycle of land and labor. Distance from water sources was important, and medieval people understood that waste should not contaminate drinking water. In towns and cities, solutions were more complex. Many homes, especially those of wealthier citizens, included privies, small enclosed toilets that emptied into cesspits. These pits were dug beneath or behind buildings and were lined to prevent collapse. Over time, they filled and required emptying. This task was carried out by professional workers, often called gong farmers. These individuals removed waste at night and transported it outside city walls for disposal or reuse. Their work was unpleasant but essential, and it was regulated by local authorities. Castles and large buildings used garderobes, which were toilets built into outer walls. Waste fell directly into moats or pits below. While this system seems unsanitary to modernize, it allowed waste to be removed from living spaces quickly. Some castles even designed garderobes so that running water could help carry waste away, showing an early attempt at sanitation. Medieval cities were aware of the dangers of unmanaged waste. Town councils passed laws regulating where waste could be dumped and when cesspits could be emptied. Fines were issued for throwing waste into streets or rivers. Although enforcement varied, the existence of such laws demonstrates concern for cleanliness and public health. Streets themselves were not as filthy as often imagined, though they were far from clean by modern standards. In many towns, residents were responsible for cleaning the area in front of their homes. Animals roamed freely, and mud was common, especially in wet weather. But waste was not meant to accumulate without control. Water channels and gutters were used to carry runoff away from living areas. Medieval understanding of disease was limited, but people believed that foul smells caused illness. This belief, known as miasma theory, motivated efforts to remove waste and reduce odors. Clean air was associated with health, and bad smells with sickness. As a result, waste management was linked directly to hygiene, even if the reasoning differed from modern science. From a historical perspective, medieval sanitation was imperfect but intentional. Systems existed, labor was assigned, and laws were written. Hygiene was not ignored. It was managed with the tools, knowledge, and resources available at the time. As this part continues calmly, imagine a medieval town at night. Streets grow quiet. Waste collectors work by lantern light. The city breathes easier by morning. Hygiene, though simple, is maintained through routine and effort. Disease shaped medieval ideas of hygiene more deeply than any other factor. In a world without microscopes or scientific medicine, illness was understood through observation, tradition, and belief. Medieval people did not know about bacteria or viruses, but they were far from careless. They watched patterns closely. They noticed that sickness spread in crowded, dirty, or foul-smelling places, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. Hygiene, therefore, became a response to fear of illness rather than an abstract idea of cleanliness. The most powerful influence on medieval hygiene practices was the plague, especially the Black Death of the 14th century. When plague swept through Europe, killing millions, it permanently altered how people thought about the body, air, and environment. Many believed that disease traveled through corrupted air, known as miasma. Bad smells were thought to carry sickness into the body through the nose and skin. Because of this belief, hygiene focused strongly on controlling odor rather than removing invisible germs. Homes were aired regularly. Windows and doors were opened when weather allowed. Smoke from fires was believed to purify the air, so people kept hearths burning even when heat was not strictly necessary. Herbs such as rosemary, thyme, lavender, and sage were burned or hung in living spaces. These practices were hygienic in intent, meant to protect the body by improving the surrounding air. Personal hygiene during times of disease became more cautious. Full bathing was sometimes reduced during outbreaks, not because people wanted to be dirty, but because warm baths were believed to open the pores. Open pores, according to medieval medicine, made the body vulnerable to poisonous air. Instead of bathing, people wiped their bodies with cloths, changed linen frequently, and washed hands and face carefully. This shift shows adaptation rather than neglect. Clothing hygiene gained new importance during plague years. Clean linen was believed to protect the body by absorbing harmful substances before they could enter the skin. People who could afford it changed undergarments more often. Clothing was aired outdoors, sometimes left in sunlight, which was believed to cleanse fabric. While medieval people did not understand why this helped, these practices often reduced parasites and moisture. Public hygiene measures also increased during disease outbreaks. Town councils ordered streets to be cleaned more frequently. Waste disposal rules were enforced more strictly. Animals were sometimes removed from city centers. Markets were regulated, and certain trades were restricted during epidemics. These actions show that medieval authorities connected cleanliness, order, and health, even without scientific explanation. Medical advice of the time often combined hygiene with behavior. People were advised to avoid crowded spaces, limit physical exertion, eat moderately, and maintain emotional calm. Excess emotion was believed to weaken the body. Hygiene, therefore, included mental balance as well as physical cleanliness. Fear itself was seen as dangerous, capable of inviting illness. Religious responses also influenced hygiene. Prayer, fasting, and ritual cleansing became more common during outbreaks. Some communities organized collective cleaning as an act of moral and physical renewal. Cleanliness was linked to divine protection. While this approach differed from modern medicine, it reinforced hygienic behavior through social and spiritual motivation. From a historical perspective, medieval responses to disease reveal adaptability. People changed routines when illness appeared. They cleaned more, managed waste more carefully, and adjusted bathing habits based on prevailing medical theories. Hygiene was dynamic, not static. It evolved in response to experience. As this long part continues quietly, imagine a medieval town during a time of sickness. Streets are swept, homes are aired, herbs scent the air. People move carefully, aware that health depends on balance. Hygiene becomes an act of protection, shaped by fear, belief, and observation rather than science. Religion played a central role in shaping medieval attitudes toward hygiene. In a deeply religious society, ideas about the body, cleanliness, and health were closely tied to spiritual beliefs. Hygiene was not understood purely as a physical necessity. It was often seen as a reflection of inner order, moral discipline, and respect for God's creation. This perspective influenced daily routines, communal behavior, and even medical advice. Christian teachings emphasized moderation. Excessive concern with the body was sometimes viewed with suspicion, especially when it appeared linked to vanity or indulgence. For this reason, frequent bathing for pleasure was discouraged in some religious texts. However, this did not mean that cleanliness itself was rejected. Washing hands, face, and feet was associated with humility, hospitality, and preparation for prayer. These practices appear repeatedly in religious instruction and monastic rules. Monasteries provide some of the clearest historical evidence of structured hygiene. Monks and nuns followed strict schedules that included regular washing. Many monasteries had dedicated washing areas, latrines, and water systems. Cleanliness was necessary for communal living and ritual purity. Monastic records describe washing before meals, after work, and before religious services. These routines demonstrate that hygiene was institutionalized within religious life. Foot washing held particular symbolic importance. It represented humility and service, inspired by biblical tradition. While symbolic, it also had practical hygienic value. In a world where people walked long distances, foot care reduced discomfort and infection. Religious ritual thus reinforced practical cleanliness. During periods of illness, religious authorities often encouraged hygienic behavior alongside prayer. Churches supported the airing of spaces, the removal of waste, and the care of the sick. While disease was sometimes interpreted as divine punishment, it was also seen as a test that required responsible action. Cleanliness became part of moral duty. The church also influenced public morality around bathhouses. As public bathing spaces became associated with social excess or improper behavior, religious leaders criticized them. This criticism contributed to the decline of bathhouses in later medieval centuries. The concern was not cleanliness itself, but the social behavior surrounding these spaces. As a result, private and controlled hygiene practices were favored over communal bathing. Religious festivals and rituals also included elements of cleansing. Preparation for major religious events often involved washing, changing clothes, and cleaning homes. These acts symbolized renewal and readiness. Hygiene thus became tied to cycles of the religious calendar, reinforcing its place in daily life. From a historical perspective, religion did not oppose hygiene, it shaped it. Cleanliness was valued when it supported order, humility, and health. Excess was discouraged, but neglect was not praised. This balance reflects the broader medieval approach to the body, care without indulgence. As this part continues quietly, imagine a monastery at dawn. Water is poured over hands. Faces are washed in silence. The body is prepared for prayer and work. Hygiene moves gently, guided by faith and routine. Hygiene among nobles and royalty in medieval times differed in scale and comfort from that of ordinary people. but it was shaped by many of the same beliefs. Wealth did not bring modern cleanliness, yet it allowed greater control over environment, water access, and personal care. Castles, manors, and royal households developed their own systems to manage hygiene within the limits of medieval knowledge. Noble households had better access to clean water. Castles were often built near reliable water sources, and some included wells within their walls. Servants were responsible for carrying water daily for cooking, washing, and cleaning. Large basins and pitchers were kept in private chambers so that lords and ladies could wash hands and faces regularly. This daily washing was considered essential to proper appearance and dignity. Full-body bathing was more accessible to the upper classes. Wealthy individuals owned wooden or metal tubs, which servants filled with warmed water. Bathing was not a daily habit, but it occurred more frequently than among peasants. Baths were often taken before important events after travel, or for medical reasons. Herbal additions were common, providing comfort and pleasant scent rather than sanitation in the modern sense. Clothing hygiene was central to noble cleanliness. Fine linen undergarments were worn beneath outer clothing and changed regularly. Laundering was done by servants using large vats, boiling water, and soap-like substances. Clean clothing signaled status, order, and health. Visible cleanliness mattered greatly at court, where appearance carried political meaning. Castles also included garderobes for waste disposal. These toilets were built into outer walls and emptied into pits or moats. While this system seems crude, it removed waste from living spaces efficiently. Larger households employed servants to maintain these areas, reducing odor and discomfort within private chambers. Personal grooming was carefully maintained. Hair was combed and sometimes washed with herbal water. Beards were trimmed. Nails were cleaned using small tools. Tooth care remained basic, but nobles were aware of dental problems and sought remedies. Pain relief, rather than prevention, was the focus. Smell was a major concern in elite spaces. Nobles used perfumes, scented oils, and herbs to improve comfort and environment. Rooms were aired, tapestries shaken out, and rushes on floors replaced regularly. These practices reduced dust, pests, and odor, contributing to a sense of cleanliness even without modern sanitation. Medical advice influenced noble hygiene strongly. Physicians serving noble households recommended bathing, rest, and cleanliness for certain conditions. At the same time, they warned against excess, especially in cold weather or during outbreaks of disease. As with all medieval hygiene, balance remained the guiding principle. From a historical perspective, noble hygiene was not luxurious by modern standards, but it was intentional and structured. Wealth allowed greater comfort, not perfect cleanliness. Castles were not spotless, but they were managed carefully to support health, status, and order. As this part continues calmly, imagine a quiet castle chamber. Water is warmed over a fire. Linen is changed. Herbs scent the air. Hygiene unfolds slowly, shaped by routine and service rather than speed. Hygiene within medieval families followed patterns shaped by age, gender, and responsibility. Children, childbirth, and household care were closely connected, and cleanliness was understood as part of nurturing rather than medical prevention. While infant mortality was high, parents and caregivers did not ignore hygiene. They practiced care in ways consistent with the knowledge and beliefs of their time. Newborn care was especially important. Midwives played a central role in childbirth and early hygiene. After birth, babies were washed with warm water and sometimes rubbed with salt or oil. This practice was believed to strengthen the skin and protect the child from illness. Swaddling cloths were kept as clean as possible, washed frequently, and aired outdoors. Linen used for infants received special attention because it came into direct contact with the body. Mothers were encouraged to rest and maintain cleanliness after childbirth. Washing the body, changing linens, and airing rooms were considered essential to recovery. Herbal washes were often used, believed to promote healing and comfort. While medical understanding was limited, the emphasis on cleanliness reflects practical observation that dirt and dampness worsened illness. Children's hygiene focused on visible cleanliness and comfort. Faces and hands were washed daily. Hair was combed regularly, both for grooming and to manage lice. Bathing occurred when water and warmth allowed. Clothing was changed as often as families could manage, with clean garments seen as protection against sickness. Parents and caretakers were aware that children were vulnerable and adjusted routines accordingly. Household hygiene extended beyond the body. Floors were swept, rushes replaced, and bedding aired. Kitchens were cleaned regularly to prevent spoilage and pests. Food preparation areas were kept separate from waste disposal as much as possible. These practices were not guided by germ theory but by experience and tradition. Women who managed most household care carried primary responsibility for hygiene. Their knowledge was practical, passed down through generations. This domestic knowledge formed the foundation of medieval hygiene. While rarely recorded in official texts, it shaped everyday life more than formal medical advice. Family hygiene also included care for the sick and elderly. Washing, changing linens, and maintaining warmth were key elements of care. Families understood that cleanliness improved comfort and dignity, even when illness could not be cured. From a historical perspective, family hygiene in medieval times was attentive and intentional. Despite hardship, caregivers worked within their means to maintain cleanliness and comfort. These practices reveal care rather than neglect. As this part continues quietly, imagine a medieval household at rest. A child's face is washed before sleep. Linen is aired near the fire. Care moves gently through the home, shaped by habit and affection. Hygiene in medieval times varied greatly depending on whether people lived in rural villages or growing towns and cities. This difference was not about awareness but about environment. Space, water access, population density, and occupation all shaped how cleanliness was practiced. When historians compare rural and urban hygiene, they see two different solutions to the same problem: how to live cleanly within limited means. In rural areas, hygiene was closely connected to nature. Villages were small, surrounded by open land, fields, and flowing water. Rivers, streams, and wells were usually nearby, making water collection easier. Waste could be disposed of at a distance from homes, reducing smell and crowding. Because of this space, rural hygiene often felt simpler and more direct. Dirt was common, but it dispersed easily. Air flowed freely, and sunlight reached most homes. Villagers washed hands and faces daily, bathed seasonally, and relied heavily on clean clothing for personal hygiene. Because families lived closer to the land, they were accustomed to mud, animals, and physical labor. Hygiene focused on comfort and function rather than appearance. Smell mattered, but it was less concentrated than in cities. The countryside allowed dirt to exist without becoming overwhelming. Urban hygiene presented greater challenges. Medieval towns were crowded with narrow streets and tightly packed buildings. Water access was shared, often drawn from public wells or fountains. Waste disposal was more difficult, and despite regulations, waste sometimes accumulated in streets or courtyards. The density of people intensified smells, noise, and illness, making hygiene a constant concern. City authorities attempted to manage cleanliness through rules and organization. Streets were divided into sections, and residents were expected to clean the area outside their homes. Waste disposal was regulated, and cesspits were monitored. Market areas were cleaned more frequently, especially where food was sold. These measures reflect awareness rather than ignorance. Urban residents also adapted personal hygiene habits. Hand washing before meals was strongly emphasized. Clothing was changed and aired frequently. People relied more on scented herbs and perfumes to manage smell in crowded spaces. Bathhouses, where available, were used more often in towns than in villages, at least until fears of disease reduced their popularity. Disease spread more quickly in cities, and this shaped urban hygiene practices. During outbreaks, towns enforced stricter cleaning, removed waste more aggressively, and sometimes limited movement. These actions show that medieval people understood the relationship between crowding and illness, even if they misunderstood its cause. Rural communities faced disease too, but its spread was slower. Isolation provided a form of protection. As a result, rural hygiene could remain more relaxed, guided by routine rather than regulation. This difference sometimes led urban observers to view rural life as cleaner, even if it was physically dirtier in some ways. From a historical perspective, neither rural nor urban hygiene was superior. Each adapted to its environment. Villages relied on space and nature. Cities relied on rules and organization. Both reveal intention, effort, and adjustment rather than neglect. As this part continues quietly, imagine a contrast at dusk. A village settles into open fields and fresh air. A city closes its gates, streets narrow and busy. In both places, people wash, clean, and prepare for rest, guided by the world around them. Medieval ideas about hygiene were closely shaped by medical thinking, which differed greatly from modern science, but followed its own internal logic. Doctors, healers, and scholars of the medieval world relied on classical texts, especially those of Hippocrates and Galen. Their medical system was built around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on keeping these humors in balance, and hygiene was one of the tools used to maintain that balance. According to medieval medicine, the body was influenced constantly by environment. Air, water, food, sleep, exercise, and emotion all affected health. Cleanliness was therefore not only about washing, but about living in a balanced way. Doctors advised people to keep their surroundings orderly, their bodies moderately clean, and their habits controlled. Excess in any direction was believed to invite illness. Medical texts often recommended washing hands and face regularly, especially before eating and after work. Clean skin was believed to help the body breathe properly. However, doctors warned against frequent hot baths. Warm water was thought to open the pores, making the body vulnerable to corrupted air. Because of this, bathing advice depended on season, age, and physical condition. The young and strong could bathe more than the elderly or sick. Hygiene advice also focused strongly on clothing. Doctors believed that clean linen helped draw harmful substances away from the body. Changing undergarments was considered healthier than frequent bathing. This belief reinforced the importance of laundry and airing clothes. Medical manuals often mention the need to keep clothing dry and free from foul smells. Diet and hygiene were closely connected. Physicians advised moderation in eating and drinking. Heavy meals were thought to burden the body and produce imbalance. Clean preparation of food mattered, not because of germs, but because spoiled food was believed to corrupt the humors. Kitchens were expected to be kept orderly, and utensils cleaned regularly. Doctors also paid attention to waste removal. Retaining waste in the body was believed to cause illness. Regular bowel movement was considered a sign of health. External waste disposal was also important, as foul smells were linked to disease. Medical advice supported city regulations that aimed to remove waste from living areas. Sleep and cleanliness were connected as well. Clean bedding, aired rooms, and fresh surroundings were believed to promote restful sleep and healthy digestion. Doctors warned against sleeping in damp or foul-smelling rooms. This advice influenced household routines, especially in wealthier homes. Emotional hygiene was another medical concern. Strong emotions such as anger, fear, or grief were believed to disturb bodily balance. Calmness, routine, and cleanliness were recommended to maintain emotional stability. This belief encouraged orderly living spaces and regular habits. From a historical perspective, medieval medical advice on hygiene was consistent within its framework. While incorrect by modern standards, it was based on observation and tradition. People followed this advice not blindly, but because it matched their experience of comfort and illness. As this part continues quietly, imagine a medieval physician giving gentle advice. Wash moderately, change linen, keep air fresh, avoid extremes. Hygiene moves slowly, guided by balance rather than precision. Modern ideas about medieval hygiene are often shaped more by exaggeration than by evidence. Over time, a number of myths developed, especially during the 19th century, when medieval life was often portrayed as dark, ignorant, and filthy. Historians today work carefully to separate these later assumptions from what medieval sources actually describe. One of the most common myths is that medieval people never bathed. Historical records clearly contradict this. Bathing existed throughout the medieval period, both privately and publicly. Bathhouses operated in towns for centuries, and private bathing was practiced when water, warmth, and resources allowed. What differed from modern life was frequency and reasoning, not the complete absence of washing. Medieval people bathed less often, but they did not avoid water entirely. Another widespread myth is that medieval people did not care about cleanliness. In reality, cleanliness was valued but defined differently. Clean hands, clean faces, fresh linen, and controlled smells were important markers of respectability. Household manuals, religious texts, and medical writings repeatedly emphasize washing, grooming, and order. Dirt was accepted as part of labor, but neglect was not admired. There is also a belief that medieval cities were constantly covered in waste. While sanitation was imperfect, towns had rules governing waste disposal, street cleaning, and cesspits. These systems were not always effective, but their existence shows intention. People complained about filth precisely because they expected better. Complaints themselves are evidence of standards. Another myth suggests that medieval people were unaware of the link between hygiene and disease. While they did not understand germs, they did observe patterns. They noticed that sickness spread more easily in crowded, dirty, and foul-smelling environments. This led to cleaning efforts during outbreaks, regulation of markets, and changes in bathing habits. Their explanations were incorrect by modern science, but their responses were logical within their understanding. The idea that medieval people preferred dirt for religious reasons is also misleading. Religious teaching discouraged vanity, not cleanliness. Washing for health, comfort, and ritual purity was accepted and encouraged. Monastic communities maintained structured hygiene routines. Excess was discouraged. Neglect was not praised. Another misconception is that only the wealthy practiced hygiene. While wealth allowed greater comfort, basic hygiene existed across all classes. Peasants washed hands and faces, changed linen, combed hair, and managed waste within their means. Hygiene was scaled to resources not absent among the poor. From a historical perspective, these myths persist because later generations judged the past by modern standards. When medieval practices are compared fairly, within their environmental and medical context, they appear practical rather than careless. Cleanliness existed shaped by belief, effort, and limitation. As this part continues quietly, imagine history clearing away exaggeration. What remains is not filth but a slower, humbler form of hygiene, one that belonged fully to its time. As the medieval period slowly moved toward its later centuries, ideas about hygiene did not change suddenly. Instead, they shifted gradually, shaped by population growth, repeated disease outbreaks, expanding trade, and the slow revival of learning. Historians describe this phase not as a break from medieval hygiene, but as an extension and refinement of existing practices. The foundations remained medieval, even as new influences began to appear. One important factor in this transition was increased urbanization. Towns grew larger and more crowded, placing greater pressure on existing sanitation systems. As populations expanded, waste management became more difficult, and the consequences of poor hygiene became more visible. This led to stricter regulation in some cities. Town councils issued more detailed rules about street cleaning, waste removal, and water protection. These rules did not always succeed, but they reflect growing awareness of environmental hygiene. Trade also influenced hygiene practices. As trade routes expanded, new materials entered Europe, including finer fabrics, perfumes, soaps, and grooming tools. Soap production increased in some regions, especially in southern Europe, where olive oil-based soaps were manufactured. These soaps slowly became more common for personal washing, particularly among urban populations. This did not replace medieval habits, but added new options. Medical writing evolved during this period as well. Scholars revisited classical texts and began to question older interpretations. While humoral theory remained dominant, doctors paid closer attention to observation and experience. Hygiene advice became slightly more detailed, emphasizing clean surroundings, fresh air, and moderation. The link between cleanliness and health, though still misunderstood, gained stronger practical emphasis. Bathing practices also changed. Public bathhouses declined further in some regions due to moral concerns and fear of disease. At the same time, private bathing increased among those who could afford it. This shift marked a move away from communal hygiene toward household-based cleanliness. Bathing became quieter, more controlled, and more private. Clothing hygiene continued to play a central role. Linen production increased, making clean undergarments more accessible. People continued to believe that clean clothing protected the body. This belief remained strong even as bathing practices shifted. Laundry, airing, and changing garments stayed at the heart of personal hygiene. Another important transition involved record keeping. More household manuals, medical guides, and civic records survived from the late medieval period. These sources provide clearer evidence of hygiene routines. They show consistency rather than neglect. Cleanliness remained tied to order, comfort, and health, not to scientific sanitation. From a historical perspective, the late medieval period represents continuity more than change. Hygiene practices adapted slowly, responding to new pressures and influences while remaining grounded in traditional belief. The medieval world did not suddenly become modern. It carried its habits forward, reshaping them gently over time. As this part continues calmly, imagine a town on the edge of change. Old routines remain. New ideas arrive quietly. Hygiene evolves, not through revolution, but through gradual adjustment within familiar patterns. To understand medieval hygiene fully, historians also examine how people experienced the world through smell. The medieval sensory environment was very different from the modern one, and smell played a central role in daily life. Cleanliness was often judged not by appearance alone, but by scent. Pleasant smells were associated with health, order, and even moral goodness, while foul smells were linked to disease, decay, and danger. Medieval towns and villages were filled with strong, familiar odors. Smoke from hearth fires drifted through streets. Animals lived close to humans, adding their presence to the air. Tanned leather, cooked food, wet earth, and human labor all contributed to a layered sensory world. Medieval people were accustomed to these smells, but they still distinguished between acceptable and unacceptable ones. Rot, waste, and stagnant air were considered harmful and undesirable. Because of this belief, managing smell became a form of hygiene. People aired their homes regularly by opening doors and windows when weather allowed. Clothes were hung outside to freshen them. Bedding was shaken and exposed to air. These actions were intended to restore balance to the environment. Fresh air was believed to protect the body by keeping harmful vapors away. Perfumes and scented substances were widely used, though not always in the luxurious way we imagine today. Herbs were the most common source of pleasant scent. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, mint, and sage were grown in gardens or gathered from the countryside. These herbs were placed in homes, sewn into clothing, or carried in small bundles. Their purpose was both practical and symbolic. They improved comfort and were believed to guard against illness. Among the wealthy, perfumes made from imported spices and resins became popular. These substances were expensive and used sparingly. Nobles might scent gloves, clothing, or chambers. Even so, scent was not meant to overwhelm. Moderation remained important. Excessive perfume could be viewed as indulgent or suspicious. Medical belief reinforced the importance of smell. According to miasma theory, corrupted air caused disease. Pleasant scents were believed to strengthen the body's resistance. Physicians often advised carrying herbs during times of illness or visiting areas with fresh air. This advice shaped personal hygiene habits, especially during epidemics. Public spaces were also managed with scent in mind. Streets were cleaned to reduce odor. Waste removal was prioritized because of smell, not appearance. Markets were regulated to prevent spoiled food from creating foul air. These efforts show that medieval hygiene operated strongly through the senses. From a historical perspective, medieval hygiene was deeply sensory. Cleanliness was something people smelled, felt, and experienced daily. While modern hygiene focuses on invisible threats, medieval hygiene focused on what the senses could detect. This difference explains many of their practices. As this part continues quietly, imagine walking through a medieval town at dusk. Smoke softens the air, herbs hang by doorways, linen dries in the breeze. Hygiene moves gently through scent and habit, shaping daily life one breath at a time. When historians compare medieval hygiene with that of the ancient Roman world, they do not describe a simple decline from cleanliness to filth. Instead, they see a shift in systems, priorities, and scale. Roman hygiene was highly centralized and public, while medieval hygiene became smaller, local, and domestic. The difference lies not in care, but in structure. The Roman world invested heavily in public hygiene. Cities were filled with aqueducts, public baths, fountains, and sewer systems. Bathing was frequent and social. Water flowed continuously through urban spaces. This system required strong central authority, engineering expertise, and constant maintenance. When the Roman Empire collapsed in Western Europe, much of this infrastructure fell into disrepair. Aqueducts broke, baths closed, cities shrank. Medieval societies inherited the remains, but not the capacity to sustain them. As Roman systems faded, medieval hygiene adapted rather than disappeared. Public baths declined in scale, but washing continued privately. Instead of large bath complexes, medieval people relied on wells, rivers, tubs, and seasonal bathing. Cleanliness moved from public institutions into households. This change reflected economic reality rather than ignorance. Roman hygiene emphasized water. Medieval hygiene emphasized clothing, air, and moderation. Clean linen replaced frequent bathing as the primary marker of cleanliness. Airing rooms, changing garments, and managing smell became central. These practices made sense in a world without aqueducts and constant water flow. Another important difference lies in medical theory. Roman medicine influenced medieval thought, but interpretation shifted. Medieval doctors inherited humoral theory but applied it more cautiously. Where Romans celebrated frequent bathing, medieval physicians warned against excess, especially in cold climates. Hygiene became protective rather than expansive. The goal was to preserve bodily balance, not to cleanse constantly. Urban life also changed dramatically. Roman cities were large and densely planned, with public sanitation as part of civic identity. Medieval cities were smaller, more crowded, and less uniform. Hygiene had to be enforced through local rules rather than infrastructure. Street cleaning laws, waste regulations, and household responsibility replaced centralized systems. Despite these differences, continuity remained. Medieval Europe did not forget Roman hygiene entirely. Bathhouses persisted for centuries. Soap production survived. Medical texts were copied and studied. The idea that cleanliness mattered never disappeared. It simply took new forms. From a historical perspective, medieval hygiene should not be seen as a failure compared to Rome. It was a response to different conditions. Where Rome relied on empire-wide systems, medieval society relied on habit, community, and domestic care. Both approaches sought health and order within their means. As this part continues calmly, imagine standing between two worlds. Behind you, the stone baths of Rome echo with water and voices. Ahead of you, a medieval town wakes quietly, linen airing in the breeze. Hygiene has changed its shape, but not its purpose. To understand medieval hygiene in its most practical form, historians often reconstruct an ordinary day and observe how cleanliness was maintained quietly, without modern urgency. Hygiene did not appear as a separate activity. It flowed naturally through routine, shaped by habit, labor, and belief. From morning until night, the medieval body was managed carefully, even if imperfectly. The medieval day usually began early, close to sunrise. Upon waking, people washed their hands and faces using cold water drawn from wells, barrels, or nearby streams. This washing was brief but meaningful. It removed sleep, sweat, and visible dirt. Clean hands were especially important as hands touched food, tools, and other people throughout the day. Household manuals and religious texts both emphasized this morning washing as a sign of readiness and order. Hair grooming followed. Hair was combed carefully, often daily. This was not only for appearance but for hygiene. Combing removed dirt, dust, and lice. Archaeological evidence of fine-toothed combs suggests regular attention to scalp care. Children and adults alike participated in this routine. Grooming was slow and repetitive, carried out by habit rather than instruction. Before the day's work began, clean clothing mattered more than clean skin. Linen garments worn close to the body absorbed sweat and dirt. Changing linen was considered cleansing. Those who could afford it changed undergarments regularly. Clothing was aired outdoors whenever possible, allowing wind and sunlight to freshen fabric. This process formed the backbone of medieval personal hygiene. During the working day, dirt was unavoidable. Farmers worked in fields, craftsmen handled materials, and townspeople moved through crowded streets. Hygiene during work focused on managing discomfort rather than eliminating dirt. Hands were washed before meals and after tasks involving waste or animals. Faces were wiped with cloths. Water use remained practical and limited. Meals were surrounded by hygienic ritual. Before eating, hands were washed, sometimes communally. Bowls and pitchers were passed around. Clean hands were a sign of respect for food and for others at the table. Shared eating made hygiene socially visible. Dirty hands were noticed and corrected. Throughout the day, homes were kept as clean as possible within limits. Floors were swept. Rushes were replaced when dirty. Cooking areas were cleaned to prevent spoilage. Waste was removed from living spaces regularly. These actions reduced smell and discomfort, which were the primary indicators of cleanliness. As evening approached, hygiene shifted toward comfort and rest. Feet were washed more often at night, especially after long days of walking or labor. This practice reduced soreness and infection. Washing feet also had symbolic meaning, associated with care and humility, reinforcing its importance. Before sleep, bedding was aired and shaken. Clean sheets were valued, though not always available. Rooms were ventilated when weather allowed. Fire smoke was believed to purify air, so hearths remained active. Clean air mattered deeply in medieval belief. Bathing, when it occurred, was usually planned rather than spontaneous. A bath might take place in the evening, especially during warm seasons or after travel. The bath was slow, deliberate, and followed by rest. It was not rushed or frequent, but meaningful. From a historical perspective, this daily routine shows that medieval hygiene was consistent and intentional. It did not aim for sterility. It aimed for balance, comfort, and order. Cleanliness unfolded gradually, embedded in daily life rather than separated from it. As this long part continues quietly, imagine a medieval household settling into night. Hands are washed, linen is smoothed, the body rests, cared for in small familiar ways. Hygiene remains present, steady, and unspoken. Hygiene in medieval times did not stop at the household door. It extended into fields, workshops, markets, and roads, shaping how people worked, traveled, and interacted outside the home. These environments posed different challenges, and medieval hygiene adapted accordingly. Cleanliness here was practical, focused on function and survival rather than comfort. In agricultural settings, hygiene was shaped by constant contact with soil, animals, and weather. Farmers spent long hours in fields, often barefoot or wearing simple footwear. Dirt was unavoidable, but it was managed. Hands were washed before eating and after handling animals. Water carried in small containers allowed for basic cleaning during the day. At the end of work, washing feet and hands was common, especially before entering living spaces. This practice reduced discomfort and prevented infection, even if its purpose was not understood scientifically. Animal care required its own hygienic routines. Stables were cleaned regularly to reduce smell and disease. Manure was removed and reused as fertilizer, keeping living areas clearer. Medieval people understood that letting waste accumulate near workspaces caused sickness and discomfort. This awareness shaped daily labor routines. Workshops in towns, such as those of blacksmiths, weavers, tanners, and bakers, faced different hygiene concerns. These spaces were often hot, crowded, and filled with smoke, dust, or strong odors. Craftsmen washed hands frequently, especially before handling food or fine materials. Aprons and outer garments protected underclothes, preserving personal cleanliness. Clothing hygiene remained central. Markets were closely regulated for hygiene. Because food was sold openly, town authorities enforced rules about cleanliness. Spoiled goods were removed. Butchers were required to keep areas clean. Waste was cleared to prevent foul smells. These regulations were motivated by health fears and public order rather than scientific sanitation, yet they reveal clear hygienic intent. Travel posed special challenges. Medieval roads were dusty in summer and muddy in winter. Inns and hostels offered basic washing facilities. Travelers washed hands and faces upon arrival, sometimes feet as well. Clean water was valued during travel, and stopping near fresh water sources was preferred. Carrying herbs to manage smell and comfort was common. Soldiers and pilgrims developed portable hygiene routines. Camps were organized to keep waste away from sleeping areas. Water sources were protected. Washing was limited but intentional. Cleanliness in camps was crucial to morale and health, even if disease still spread easily. Medieval military texts sometimes include advice on camp order and cleanliness, showing awareness of its importance. Public wells and fountains served as hygiene centers. People gathered there not only to collect water, but to wash, talk, and maintain routine. These spaces were socially regulated. Polluting water sources was forbidden, highlighting their central role in hygiene. From a historical perspective, medieval hygiene in work and travel was adaptive. It responded to environment and necessity. cleanliness was not abandoned outside the home. It changed form, remaining practical and routine. As this part continues calmly, imagine a medieval road at sunset. A traveler washes dust from hands at a stream. A farmer cleans boots before entering home. Work ends, and hygiene follows, quiet and habitual. Hygiene during warfare in medieval times followed a different rhythm from civilian life, shaped by movement, danger, and necessity. Soldiers lived closely together, often for long periods, and this closeness made cleanliness both difficult and important. While conditions were harsh, medieval armies did not ignore hygiene. They adapted it to the realities of marching, camping, and siege. When armies were on the move, hygiene focused on protecting water and managing waste. Camps were usually set up near fresh water sources, but rules existed to keep those sources clean. Waste was placed downhill or at a distance from streams and wells. This separation was intentional. Medieval commanders understood that polluted water led to sickness, even if they could not explain why. Camp order manuals and military advice texts often mention keeping living areas, animals, and waste apart. Soldiers washed hands and faces when water was available. Full bathing was rare during campaigns, but wiping the body with cloths was common. Clothing was shaken, aired, and dried whenever possible. Clean linen remained important, even on campaign. Soldiers who could change undergarments did so, especially after long marches. This practice reduced discomfort, rashes, and parasites. Foot care was especially important in armies. Marching long distances caused sores, infections, and exhaustion. Soldiers washed feet when stopping for the night and dried them carefully. This routine was practical and widely practiced. Commanders knew that injured feet weakened the army more than many weapons. Lice and parasites were constant companions in military life. Soldiers combed hair and shared grooming tools. Camps developed informal routines to manage infestations. While lice were accepted as unavoidable, effort was made to control them. Hygiene here was about reduction, not elimination. Sieges created unique hygiene challenges. When armies settled for weeks or months around a fortified city, waste accumulation became dangerous. Camps were reorganized repeatedly to manage smell and disease. Latrine areas were established. Fires were kept burning to reduce odor and believed to cleanse the air. These practices reflected fear of sickness spreading through dense camps. Inside besieged cities, hygiene conditions often worsened. Overcrowding, limited water, and blocked waste removal strained systems. City authorities attempted to maintain order by enforcing cleaning, but resources were limited. Disease became a greater threat than enemy weapons. Historical accounts frequently describe illness-breaking sieges, highlighting the role of hygiene and environment in warfare. Religious belief also influenced military hygiene. Soldiers prayed for protection from illness and followed ritual cleanliness before battle. Cleanliness was associated with readiness and divine favor. Washing before important moments held symbolic and practical meaning. From a historical perspective, medieval military hygiene shows awareness under pressure. Soldiers and commanders recognized that disorder and filth weakened forces. Their responses were imperfect, but deliberate. Hygiene adapted to war just as it adapted to peace. As this part continues quietly, imagine a medieval camp at dusk. Fires burn low. Soldiers wash hands in shared basins. Boots are removed. The day's dust settles. Even in war, hygiene persists, shaped by routine and survival. As this long historical journey slowly comes to rest, medieval hygiene appears not as a story of neglect, but as one of adaptation. When the noise of exaggeration fades, what remains is a quieter truth. Medieval people lived in a world shaped by labor, belief, climate, and limited knowledge. Yet within that world they developed routines that aimed for balance, comfort, and order. Cleanliness existed, though it followed different rules than our own. Across villages, towns, castles, monasteries, roads, and battlefields, hygiene moved with daily life. Hands were washed. Linen was changed. Hair was combed. Air was refreshed. Waste was managed. These actions were small, repeated, and familiar. They did not aim to defeat invisible germs, but to reduce discomfort, smell, and illness as people understood them. Cleanliness was sensed through touch and scent rather than measured scientifically. Medieval hygiene was shaped by environment. Where water was abundant, washing increased. Where cold and fear of illness dominated, moderation prevailed. Clean clothing replaced frequent bathing. Fresh air replaced chemical sanitation. Balance replaced intensity. This system was not perfect, but it was intentional. Disease, especially plague, left deep marks on hygiene practices. Fear of corrupted air reshaped bathing habits, waste management, and household routines. Religious belief reinforced moderation and care. Medical advice guided people toward order rather than excess. Together, these influences formed a coherent approach to cleanliness within medieval limits. When viewed historically, medieval hygiene reflects human resilience. People worked with what they had. They observed patterns. They adjusted behavior. They passed knowledge quietly from one generation to the next. Hygiene was not ignored. It was lived. As the night grows still, imagine medieval life settling into rest. Fires dim. Water is set aside. Linen lies clean enough for sleep. The body, cared for in small ways, prepares for another day. This is the medieval world at ease with itself, moving slowly through time,